In June 1987, a Soviet helicopter flew low over the southern Ural steppe. The crew was mapping a valley scheduled to be flooded. A dam was coming. 12 villages were going to disappear underwater within months. One of the men looked down and saw a perfect circle in the grass. Two perfect circles, actually, one inside the other. He told the pilot to turn around. He took a photograph. When he developed it that evening, he understood what he was looking at, and he understood immediately that the dam could not be built. The thing he had photographed was 4,000 years old. It had no name. It had no place in any history book. And it had been built with mathematics that, according to every textbook ever printed, would not be invented for another 1,500 years. This is the story of Arkaim, a city that should not exist, a people we do not know, and a star map carved into the steppe by hands we cannot identify.
The valley was called Bolshaya Karaganka, southern Urals, 300 kilometers from the Kazakh border, cold in winter, dry in summer, empty. The Soviets had decided in 1986 that the valley would be flooded to create a reservoir for nearby farms. 12 villages condemned, surveys complete, construction equipment already moving in. Standard procedure required an archaeological survey before flooding. A small team from Chelyabinsk State University was sent. 2 students, 1 professor named Gennady Zdanovich, a few shovels. They were expected to walk the valley, find nothing, and sign off the paperwork. That was when the helicopter pilot showed Zdanovich the photograph. Zdanovich did not believe it. A perfect circle in the steppe, diameter 160 meters. Inside it, a second circle. Inside the second circle, a small open courtyard. He drove out to the location. He walked the rings. He found mounds in the grass, collapsed walls, buried beneath 4 millennia of soil.
He started digging. Within weeks, he understood what was below his feet. A city, a planned city, designed before a single stone was laid. 2 concentric rings of timber and clay houses, 60 in the inner ring, 35 in the outer. Each house shared walls with its neighbors. Each had a hearth, a well, a furnace, and a sleeping area. Each opened onto a single circular street that wrapped between the 2 rings. There were 4 gates, aligned to the 4 cardinal directions. The main gate faced west toward the setting equinox sun. The city was burned deliberately. Every house, every wall, every wooden beam set on fire by the inhabitants themselves before they left. Nothing was looted, nothing was destroyed in violence. The bodies of their dead had been removed and taken elsewhere. The city had been emptied, blessed, and burned to the ground. Zdanovich dated the ash. The fire happened around 1700 BC. The city had been built around 2000 BC. The dam was canceled. The valley was preserved. Arkaim, named for the small mountain that overlooks the site, became one of the most controversial archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. It is still controversial today, because nothing about Arkaim makes sense.
Begin with what should not be possible. Arkaim was built in a single phase. There are no expansion layers, no earlier huts beneath the foundations, no rebuilt walls. The entire city, 190 meters in outer diameter, capable of housing 2,000 people, was laid out, surveyed, and constructed as a unit. This means someone designed it first, on paper or in mind, and then built it. The Bronze Age was not supposed to do this. Bronze Age settlements grow organically. A house here, a house there, a wall added later when the population swelled. Arkaim is the opposite. Arkaim is a blueprint. And the blueprint contains mathematics. The outer ring's radius is exactly twice the inner ring's, a 2-to-1 proportion. The inner courtyard is divided into segments whose dimensions reflect the golden ratio, 1 to 1.618, 5 centuries before Pythagoras was born. The unit of measurement the Sintashta engineers used has been calculated by Russian archaeologists. It comes to 80 centimeters. The same unit appears almost to the millimeter in megalithic structures across Europe, from Stonehenge to the stone circles of Brittany. Archaeologists call it the megalithic yard, and they cannot explain how it spread 3,000 kilometers in a culture that had no writing. There is more. Inside the houses, archaeologists found furnaces, not simple fire pits, engineered furnaces with double-chambered airflow, controlled draft channels, and clay liners capable of reaching temperatures around 1,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to smelt copper, hot enough to alloy tin into bronze, hot enough in some cases to work iron, 800 years before the Iron Age officially began. Every house had one, not a central forge for the city. 65 households, each one a metallurgical laboratory, each one producing bronze weapons, tools, and ornaments that have been found from the Volga to the borders of China. 2,000 people, no king, no palace, no temple visibly larger than any other building, no evidence of slaves, no evidence of war, no evidence of hierarchy at all. A perfectly symmetrical machine city, built by people who left no writing, ruled themselves somehow, smelted alloys that should not have existed, and used a unit of measurement that had already crossed a continent. This is the second seal, and it gets stranger. Konstantin Bestroushkin was a Russian astronomer. In the 1990s, he spent 6 years mapping Arkaim's walls against the sky. What he found was this. The 4 cardinal gates of the city are not exactly aligned to north, south, east, and west. They are offset, each by a few degrees. Bestroushkin assumed at first that this was construction error, Bronze Age builders working without modern instruments, getting close but not perfect. Then he checked the offsets against the precession of the equinoxes. The precession is the slow wobble of Earth's axis, taking 26,000 years to complete one full rotation. It means that the position of celestial north, the star the axis points toward, drifts across the sky over millennia. The pole star today is Polaris. 4,000 years ago, it was a different star in a different position. Arkaim's gates are not aligned to true north today. They are aligned to true north as it was in 2000 BC. Whoever built this city understood that the sky moves over time, and they corrected for it. Bestroushkin kept measuring. He found that specific points along the city's outer wall, small notches, post holes, doorway thresholds, align with the rising and setting positions of the sun on the summer solstice, the winter solstice, both equinoxes. 10 solar events, each marked by a built feature. Then, the moon. The moon's orbit is more complex than the sun's. It tilts, it wobbles. Its extreme rising and setting points cycle every 18.6 years. To track the moon's full range of motion, you need to observe it across nearly 2 decades, and you need to build something that marks the limits. Bestroushkin identified 18 lunar alignments in Arkaim. Major standstill north, minor standstill north, major standstill south, cross-quarter risings, eclipse positions, all marked, all built. 28 celestial events, 10 solar, 18 lunar. Stonehenge has 9 alignments, confirmed at most 15, built around the same time. Arkaim has nearly twice as many, and the precision is roughly 3 times higher. Stonehenge's alignments are accurate to about 1 degree. Arkaim's are accurate to 0.3 degrees. To achieve this precision, you need spherical trigonometry, the mathematics of measuring angles on a sphere, the sphere being the sky overhead. Spherical trigonometry was formally developed by the Greek astronomer Hipparchus around 150 BC. Arkaim was built 1,800 years earlier. There is no explanation for this in any textbook. The Sintashta people left no writing. They left no schools. They left no library of astronomical observations on clay tablets the way the Babylonians did. They had no precision instruments, no theodolites, no sextants, no telescopes. By every measure of conventional archaeology, they should not have been able to build what they built. But they built it, and it works, and it is still standing. Around 1700 BC, the people of Arkaim emptied their city and burned it to the ground. Not all Bronze Age settlements end this way. Most end in war. Bodies in the doorways, smashed pottery, looted storerooms, hasty abandonment. Some end in plague, mass graves, hurried burials, no successor settlement. A few end in slow decline. Fewer houses occupied each generation, the population drifting away. Arkaim ended in none of these ways. The houses were empty when they burned. No bodies inside, no personal belongings left behind, no valuables, no tools, no weapons. The dead from earlier generations had been exhumed and taken away. Even the grain stores were emptied. Then the wooden frames and roof beams of every single house were piled with combustible material, and the city was set on fire, methodically, structure by structure, in a way that suggests a planned ritual rather than a chaotic event. When the fires died, the inhabitants did not return. Across the southern Urals, the same pattern repeated. The other settlements of the Sintashta culture, and we now know there were many, were abandoned in the same way. Sintashta itself, the site that gave the culture its name. Olgano, Ustye, Quisak, Stepnoi. Each one swept clean. Each one burned. Each one left to fall back into the steppe. A whole civilization walking away from its cities on purpose. In Vedic Sanskrit, there is a word, Agnihotra, the sacred fire offering. The Rig Veda describes it as a ritual of departure, fire used not to destroy, but to consecrate, to return a place to the gods before leaving it, to burn what cannot be carried so that nothing impure remains behind. In Zoroastrian Avesta, written later but drawing from the same root, fire is the medium through which a community blesses the earth and asks for protection on its journey. The Sintashta people, archaeologists now believe, did not vanish. They migrated. They moved south and east, toward what is now Iran, what is now India. They took their language with them. They took their religion with them. They took their stories with them. And they took their dead. The indo-iranian languages, Sanskrit, Avestan, Persian, Pashto, Hindi, Urdu, descend from a common ancestor language spoken somewhere on the steppe around 2000 BC. That somewhere may have been Arkaim. The Rig Veda is the oldest religious text in the world that is still in active use, composed orally between 1500 and 1200 BC, memorized, recited, passed mouth to mouth for nearly 1,000 years before it was written down. It describes the homeland of the people who composed it, a cold place, a high place, a place between two rivers, a place where the summer days were long and the winter nights longer still, a place where the polar star wheeled differently in the sky than it does in India. The Rig Veda describes circular cities. It uses the word pur, fortress, settlement, ringed enclosure. It describes them as the 7, or sometimes the 10, or sometimes the 100 purs of the gods. Each pur had walls of timber. Each had 4 gates. Each was built for ritual as much as for habitation. It describes a great fire ritual called Agnihotra, performed before a journey. It describes a people who knew the stars by name, who measured the year in months and the month in days, who understood that the equinoxes moved across the sky over the lives of many generations. It describes a homeland called Sapta Sindhu, the land of 7 rivers, but it remembers, in older verses, a homeland north of that, a colder one, a circular one. Arkaim sits between 2 rivers, the Bolshaya Karaganka and the Utyaganka. Its inner ring has gates aligned to the 4 directions. Its walls are timber and clay. Its its inhabitants performed fire rituals before they left. The location is high enough in latitude that the summer solstice produces near white nights, the sun barely setting before it rises again. This is not proof. The Rig Veda is poetry, not a map. The connection between Arkaim and the indo-Iranian homeland is, in academic terms, a hypothesis, a strong one, supported by genetics, by linguistics, by the migration of horse and chariot technology southward from the steppe, but a hypothesis. What is not hypothesis is this. Around 2000 BC, on the cold steppe of the southern Urals, someone built a city in the shape of a perfect circle. They aligned its walls to 28 celestial events using mathematics that had not yet been invented. They lived inside it for 300 years. They burned it down and walked south. Several hundred years later, in the warm rivers of northern India, their descendants began to sing hymns describing a homeland of cold and circles and fire. The hymns were never written down. They were memorized, word for word, inflection for inflection, for 1,000 years. The hymns are still being sung today. Somewhere, in a temple in Varanasi or Pune or Madurai, a Brahmin priest is reciting verses about a place his ancestors left 4,000 years ago. The place is still there. It is in the grass of the southern Urals. And from the helicopter, you can still see the circles. 5 seals. 1 impossibility. A city designed before it was built using a unit of measurement that crossed 3,000 kilometers, equipped with metallurgical furnaces in every house, aligned to 28 celestial events with precision 3 times greater than Stonehenge, constructed using mathematics that, according to every textbook, would not exist for another 1,800 years. Emptied, burned, abandoned on purpose, by people who walked south and east and whose descendants composed the oldest sacred text still in use on Earth. The story of Arkaim is not the story of one city. It is the story of how much of human knowledge has been lost. Because Arkaim is not alone. In 1995, satellite imaging began to reveal other circles in the steppe. By 2005, 23 confirmed Sintashta settlements had been identified. By 2026, LiDAR scans of the southern Urals suggest there may be more than 100, most still buried, most still unexplored. Russian archaeologists call the area Strana Gorodov, the country of towns. It is roughly the size of Belgium, and every town in it was built to the same plan, with the same mathematics, by the same vanished people. We do not know who they were. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know how many cities they built before the one called Arkaim, or how many they built after. We know they could read the sky better than the Greeks. We know they could smelt alloys before alloys were supposed to exist. We know they walked away from everything they made and turned themselves into a religion. In the next journey, we go further north, because the Sintashta were not the first. Beneath the permafrost of central Siberia, archaeologists are finding stone structures older than Arkaim, megaliths older than Stonehenge, burial mounds containing skeletons whose DNA does not match any modern population. The Greeks called the land beyond the north wind Hyperborea, a place of perpetual light, ruled by Apollo, populated by a people who lived 1,000 years and never knew war. They thought it was a myth. We are starting to think it wasn't.